Okay, good morning, everyone. I think we can start this webinar while other people might join in the meantime. So my name is Vasilis Papandreou, and I will be your host for today's webinar, where we will discuss the results of the study on the implementation of the methodologies to calculate adequacy metrics on the electricity sector in the EU. I was involved in this topic from the early beginning. So when the clean energy package was adopted, and I remember the lively dialogues that we had at the time with the regulatory community, the transmission system operators, and the stakeholders. And it was actually our monitoring activity on the security of supply of electricity sector in the following years that made us think that it would be actually very meaningful and useful to try and look deeper on how member states implemented these methodologies to calculate these matrices that are very important for security of supply policies. So I'm pleased today to be hosting this webinar and to listen with you the results of this study from our consultants. And I'm actually also very curious to read and listen to your questions on the topic in the Q&A session that will follow. So before I hand over to our consultants, I will remind you a bit of our housekeeping rules. So the webinar is recorded, and you will be able to download the recording session, I think tomorrow from our website, from ACER's website. Microphones are muted, and also the chat and Q&A feature of Teams is also blocked, apart from organizers. However, this doesn't mean that there is not going to be any interaction. You can pose your questions at the Slido that you see in this slide, but also on the chat during the whole webinar. So you don't have to wait for the presentation to end. You can post the questions directly there. This Slido will also be used for some questions by the presenters during the presentation. So please do try to reply to these questions. It will make the webinar much more interesting. And also, we will tackle some of the questions. The support team will tackle some of the questions if they relate to technical issues or clarifications. And we will deal with the rest of the questions, the rest relevant questions at the Q&A session. So without any further delay, I'm handing over to Johannes from the University of Linz, and to Aaron Praktikno from Technical University of Aachen. Johannes and Aaron, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot for the introduction, Vasilis. Good morning and welcome also from my side. My name is Johannes Reichel. I've been a head of this study jointly done by two research institutes, the Energy Institute in Linz, Austria, and RWTH Aachen University in Germany, and I will introduce the team in a minute to you. So today we are presenting the results of our study that we've carried out over the last, I think it was 8 months, how the methodology that ACER has developed as one of the elements for assuring resource adequacy in Europe in the future, how this methodology for these 3 important metrics has been implemented, what have been identified as eventually a bit as shortcomings, where can we make recommendations how this methodology can be implemented even better in the future, and thereby hopefully provide valuable support for all who are interested in the methodology and are about to implement it themselves. So the first part of this webinar again, that is the presentation of the results that we have developed over the last months. But as Vasily said, an important part as well is your opinions. And there are two questions that we're going to ask you in Slido. These questions are of particular relevance and interest to us because with you, as you have signed up for this webinar, we know you are much interested in the topic. You have for sure a lot of knowledge about the topic. And so your opinion is very relevant for us. And we really ask you to participate in our Slido questions. The lessons learned from them will be very important input for us. And of course, there's a Q&A session, and we really hope for a vital engagement of all of you with that. So in Slido, you answer, please, the questions that we have for you, and at the same time, you pose questions for us. And those questions that others have already asked, you can put a like to them, so we will know that many of you are interested in hearing an answer on this question or have a discussion around this question. So we decided to start before we have any substantial discussion about the content of the study directly with a Slido question to you. And before I show you the link to enter that Slido questions, please be aware that this Slido contains two questions, but we want each of you only to answer one of these questions. And to know which of the questions is made for you, we have assigned a first letter of your surname to each of the questions, so you will easily see that question is meant for me according to my surname. So before that, let me quickly have a look at the agenda. So I'm going to introduce the team. I am introducing the topic of the study, why it has been launched. I think is relatively clear to the subscribers, but we repeat that to avoid any misunderstanding of that. And then I give a quick look on the methodology that we have used and also on the base of information that we could use in exploiting your reports. We then come to the results. I think that's the core part of this presentation. And as we have realized, and as many of you have signaled to us, the biggest challenge of this whole methodology is the value of lost load. So this is one of the three metrics. And that's why we are going to dedicate most of this webinar to this value of lost load. First, we present an analysis of how member states have implemented their respective methodology. And then we are deriving from our insights a couple of recommendations, how we think future calculations can be facilitated and improved and made an even better experience for all participants. We will then come to the two other matrix, cost of new entry and reliability standard, each of which we are presenting only in a bit shorter way. Problems associated with these two metrics have not been perceived as big as for the value of lost load, but still it's interesting to have a look into that as well. And then we're coming to the overview and to the main conclusions that we derived here, of course, in a bit condensed form. Final report will be more elaborate, but to give you an idea of where we see the biggest challenges and the way forward. And then, yes, we hope to see you in our Q&A session intensively involved. And now we're coming to the Slido question. Please take part in it. Please check out to which of the two questions you are assigned to, and let us have a look then later on together about the results. We don't show the results right away, but please include your information now and we jointly have a look at that then. So we give us a minute or two to complete these Q&A, to compute that Slido question, and then we continue with the presentation here. I hope you've all found the way to the Slido question. We're really very interested in how such a distinguished audience will evaluate their respective question. Always super interesting to see the different opinion and answers between, let's say, the average energy consumer and the more expert level in that regard. So that is one of the things really interesting to us. So of course, Slido will stay open for a bit, but I will continue with the presentation now. So please try to find your answer on the question. Of course, there is no wrong and no right, so don't worry, you don't have to try to find a specific value. That is not the purpose of this question. Now, let me quickly introduce our studies so that you get an idea of what was our ambition and what was our proceeding. First of all, who was the team that conducted this study? I already said the Energy Institute, Department of Energy Economics, which I am a head of, was one of the consultants involved in this study. We as the Energy Institute have now more than 20 years of experience with regulatory economics. We are a non-university institute, so working in a lot of research activities, research projects on behalf of various contractors, funding schemes. We are currently 40 people, so we do have a critical level of manpower to engage in these kind of questions. And one particular thing I want to mention here about our institute is that we have not only an energy economic expertise, but also experts in energy law and energy technology. So together we can address many relevant questions, multidisciplinary, to make us a future energy system that's prosperous and sustainable. And we have a variety of topics that we are addressing. So besides me today in our telco are Rudolf Capella and Katharina Rusch, very supportive colleagues. Melanie Knöbel as well, supportive, but she is not present here today. On the side of RWTH Aachen University, the group, the chair for energy system economics is led by Professor Aaron Praktiknio. He will be a speaker here today as well. Group is with 24 people as a whole, also a very, very strong group, and they have an amazing track record in the topic that we're talking today and in energy system analysis, also from a multidisciplinary perspective, dealing with policy questions, technology questions in relation to the economic setting that we require for a prosperous future energy system. And here are listed some of their highlight publications and projects that they have and are continuously conducting. So we're very happy to have them on board. And in addition to Professor Praktiknio, we have his team, Christina Köckel, Jan Prisman, and Jakob Kulawik here today with us again, and jointly we will involve in answering your questions later on as good as we can. Now, what's the point here? What is a very quick, let's say, point of the study and underlying of the purpose of implementing this methodology? So by security of supply, we all have an idea of what that is. The more formal definition is like the ability of an electricity system to guarantee the supply of electricity to consumers with a clearly established level of performance. And what comes now, I think, is very important, as determined by the member state concerned. So supply security, that is not defined on any higher level. That is not something given from above, basically, but each country themselves have to identify what is the right level of supply security they need, considering that supply security had costs and supply security has benefits. And what we need to do is to find a sweet spot between the costs for establishing higher levels of supply security and the benefits we get from avoiding outages, which are incurring costs themselves. So we talk of that kind of sweet spot as the reliability standard. That is the level of security of supply that, considering the costs of increasing, while the costs of happening power outages, meet an optimized level from an economic point of view. That is a reliability standard, and that is the ultimate objective of these metrics that we are computing here, or that you have been computing, or your national organizations, and that we had a look at how this fits into the methodology. Now, and who has to calculate it? It's mandatory for those countries who do have a capacity mechanism in place, so who are having, in addition to the energy-only market, a capacity mechanisms. That means it's not currently mandatory for all European Union countries, and we have a look at who these countries are, whose reports we have been looking at. Vol, Cone, and RS value of lost load, cost of new entry, and reliability standard. So ACER has developed on behalf of the European Commission an EU-wide methodology. So each of these quantities has to be computed and calculated according to a very specific methodology. Still, there is room for justified choices within the methodology. And that makes it so interesting who took what choices, how do respective choices allow comparability of the final results. So that is what we have been looking at. Well, as a subscriber here of this webinar, you know that is the damage caused by an interruption of the electricity supply, and we measure it in euro per kilowatt hour. Cone on the other side is the cost that additional capacity would cost. We give it in euro per megawatt capacity, and this capacity can be generation capacity classically, but it can also relate to storage capacity or to demand response that allow us to balance certain deviations between demand and production. And as the ultimate goal, we have the reliability standard, and that is given in hours, in expected numbers of hours where the capacity resources are insufficient to meet the demand. And we calculate that from the wall and the cone, and then have this kind of a sweet spot in supply security in each of the member states. Now, we have launched this study for a very specific reason. After 2020, when the methodology of ACER has been approved, obliged countries were gradually implementing the methodology. And ACER has found in their investigation of the incoming reports that there are differences between the countries that are not always explained by the different economic structures of the countries, but that raised some doubt if not the methodology or the application and implementation of the methodology may have played a significant role in what we see. And so ACER has finally decided to contract an outside organization to have a thorough investigation of what might be the reasons for the deviations seen, to what extent are they justified, and how can we achieve in the future a better, even better comparability of the results. Now, just as one example, why we are thinking here is a bit of too much heterogeneity in the results. These are the results of the whole of the countries that have calculated them. And we do see that the difference is by factor 10 between Greece and the Netherlands. And we do think that these cannot be rooted in the true dependence, in the true value of supply security. So that is the reason why we have this study now undertaken. Very briefly, what have we done? We have started in September last year. We have done by desk research investigating the reports that have been submitted to ACER. Then some questions could not be answered by reading the reports only, and we had interviews with the responsible parties. Normally one interview, sometimes even a second one, if still clarifications had to be made. And then we have presented our first preliminary results in a first webinar that was open only to those entities that have actually prepared the reports. So we could have a discussion about our findings. And now we're presenting to you the final results with all the input that we received throughout this process. What's the structure? What's the method? I already said desk research and interviews that have been the key ingredients to us. Here you see in the table which countries have been included in our study, and you see for which country, which of these three metrics has been reported on. Most countries have reported on all the three metrics. Poland and Netherlands did not have this full set, but we held interviews with all of them. And again, mandatory is the provision of these metrics only for those with capacity mechanism in place, but also countries who have decided to calculate these metrics based on the ACER methodology are investigated here or could be investigated here if they may have made this choice. So that is our approach here and the database that we had. I already said value of lost load. That is the one thing where many had the biggest challenges. And that's why we are dedicating here now the important section of this webinar, coming to the results about the value of load. And I'm now very, very happy that Professor Aaron Praktikniu is presenting this part of our results now to you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Johannes. Good morning also from my side. I am Aaron Praktikniu, and I have the pleasure of talking to you now about the value of loss load in further detail. So basically, the issue was, how do we determine what is the correct value of loss load? So what is the value for the consumers for unsupplied electricity, or if we rephrase that in another way, what is the value for consumer for a secure supply of electricity? So on the production side, if you want to balance things out, things may be more straightforward. What are the costs for increasing security of supply? Then we can look in a way at the cost of adding additional capacities, the cost of producing additional electricity, so to say. This is more or less straightforward. Of course, there are additional difficulties if we look in more detail, but for the consumer side, it's even more difficult, I may say, because what is actually the value of a secure supply of electricity or unsupplied electricity for the consumers? So there are different approaches on how we can determine that, but actually, of course, it is very dependent on the consumer himself or herself. So in literature, we find different methods on how to determine this value of loss load. There are survey-based methods. So we ask the people what their value of loss load is in a direct way or in an indirect way. Another method is to use statistical data, macroeconomic data, to derive, using assumptions from these macroeconomic data, the value of loss load for the electricity consumers. And a third option is to use revealed preferences methods. So we go out, watch in reality how consumers behave if they are faced with different choices for different levels of security of supply, so to say, and then derive from these different behaviors faced with the different choices what the value of loss load is. And with this, the last method, the revealed preference method, is basically out of the question, at least for now, because rarely we will have consumers which are faced with different choices for a level of security of supply. So this leaves basically in practice only two methods, the survey-based method and the macro data-based method, even though revealed preferences method may be really appropriate and may give us the most realistic numbers, because these figures are derived from consumers who had real life choices and had to face the real consequences of their choices. So this being said, the methodology that was set by ACER to determine the value of lost load was the survey-based approach, or at least a bandwidth of survey-based approaches. So here ACER gave actually two options, either to conduct a new survey for the different consumers using a standardized questionnaire to figure out what the value of loss load is, or alternatively, if a country just recently already on their own carried out a survey to determine the value of loss load, it would be possible to use also this existing survey. And if it is recent enough, at least 5 years old, fulfilling the basic requirements set by the ACER methodology. Then, if we focus on the survey-based methods, in principle, there are three approaches to determine the value of loss load in a survey. The first one is called an approach based on the willingness to pay. So basically, the first question you were asked in the Slido questionnaire, how much would you be willing to pay to avoid power interruption of a specific duration or with these and these characteristics? The consumers are asked how much they would be willing to pay out of their own pocket to avoid a specific scenario. Then the second option would be the willingness to accept approach, where it basically was the second question for those with the surnames in the alphabet coming in the second half, on the willingness to accept, asking the consumers how much would they be willing to accept for compensation to accept a scenario of being interrupted from their electricity supply. So now the consumer will receive money to accept an interruption. And the third option to determine the value of lost load is the direct worth approach. So asking consumers directly how much damage or how much economic value would be lost for you, consumer, if you would not have this electricity supply. So if the security of supply for you would be lower, yeah, or higher, depending on the direction. Well, in the ACER methodology, the willingness to pay approach, WTP, is defined as the baseline, but this methodology also leaves open other methods which can be used to calculate the value of lost load. So just saying now, we are going to talk about that in more detail in a minute. The choice of estimation of the method has actually quite a strong impact on the value of lost load. So what are the minimum survey components of ACER? It will be information about the type of consumer. You can imagine that a heavy industry may have a different value of lost load compared to a company in the service sector or a private household. Then also information about the electricity consumption, the volume, for instance, that might be also necessary to calculate the value of lost load. Then power interruption scenarios for the evaluations, they have to be specified regarding the outage duration. So of course, the value of lost load or the economic damage would be different if the duration would last an hour or if it would last, let's say, 4 hours. Then the period of occurrence, it might be a different story if electricity is unsupplied in the middle of the day or in the middle of the night. So as this might have a strong impact, the period of occurrence needs to be included in the survey. Then whether or not the pre-notification is existent, saying that will the consumer be pre-notified, let's say a day ahead or several hours ahead, that there's going to be an interruption of the consumer's power supply? Yes or no? Because if there is a pre-notification, then the consumer can prepare accordingly. I don't know, in the households, on a household level, maybe prepare some candles to avoid sitting in complete darkness if the outage is taking place in the middle of the night. So these are the minimum survey components defined in the ACER methodology. Maybe an important thing to mention would be that the unit for the value of lost load is in monetary unit per unit of unsupplied electricity. So it's not a euro figure only, but it's a figure in euro per kilowatt hours for countries with the euro, so to say. So what we Johannes already talked about the differences between the member countries, the reports regarding their value of loss load. So we have seen a factor of 10 in between the country with the highest reported value of loss load and the country with the lowest value of loss load. This is a very, very high difference. So we were wondering what could be the factors influencing in which direction the value of loss load would deviate, because the methodology of ACER is quite complex, leaving also room for different choices, and depending on the choices that a country, a member state is making, then the result on the value of loss load might be higher or lower. So, for instance, the outage duration has a negative impact on the value of loss load. That might come a bit surprising, but as the value of loss load is in euro per kilowatt hour, if we have a longer duration of an outage, then the value of loss load in euros per kilowatt hour will be lower. We can talk about this later on in this discussion if you want. Then the pre-notification. If there is a pre-notification, then the value of loss load is bound to be lower, because of course, if the consumer has a chance to prepare him or herself against a looming power interruption, then the economic damage might be lower. Then the period of occurrence makes quite a difference. So in the summer season, maybe also during off-peak hours, so in a summer night, maybe it's not that high, the value of loss load, compared to in the evening hours during winter. Yeah. Then societal cost can or cannot be included in the value of loss load. For instance, seeing that the European Soccer Championship is right around the corner, does it make a difference if there's a power interruption during the final game of the European Championship? If we say yes and account for this, then of course, then the value of loss load will be higher. If this is not accounted for, then the value of loss load will be lower. Furthermore, how do we convert willingness to pay to value of loss load? Because in the questionnaire you just had in the Slido, you entered a number in euros, and how do we convert this to value of loss load? Basically by dividing by the electricity consumption that you have in that specific time. So you were asked a specific scenario at 6 p.m. I think it was, and now what do we take for electricity consumption to divide the number with that you've stated in here with the willingness to pay? Would this be average numbers? So we see how much electricity would you consume in a year on average, knowing that in fact, of course, you consume different amounts of electricity, different amounts of power at different times. So it could be that if we use average numbers, the figure would be higher. If we use profile-based numbers, then this figure might become lower. Then the estimation method. So the standard baseline is the willingness to pay approach, but there is some room also to use a macro based approach, so data based on macroeconomic statistics. Then if we take these numbers instead of survey data from the willingness to pay, usually the direction is negative, that we receive lower value numbers for value of loss load if we use statistical data than if we use survey-based approaches. That is due to the fact that some cost components are not included in the statistical data. For instance, risk aversion is not included in the macro data, or also direct cost component. So to say, let's say you have food in your freezer, food in your fridge, and that food is spoiled after a power outage, then this is not included in the macro data. Or you have a large company, industrial company, which is producing goods, and then a power interruption hits, and maybe some of the goods which were bound to being produced cannot be continued to be produced, and they have to be thrown away. Then these losses would not be reflected in the macroeconomic data. So this is why this figure might be lower. Then there's another approach, this direct worth approach, asking the people, the consumers, how much their value of lost load is in their opinion. And here it's actually questionable whether or not this could be higher than the willingness to accept or lower than the willingness to pay. So this could be somewhere in between. Furthermore, there are sectoral weights. We already mentioned that there are different types of consumers involved here in, of course, electricity consumption. And how do we weight them? So each of these consumers, they may have different value of lost loads. And how do we put them together if we want to calculate the value of lost load, the single value of lost load reflective for our whole country, for our economy? So one way to do that is to use consumption shares, consumer shares, to weigh the value of lost load. So we take annual consumption shares. I don't know, the heavy industry, maybe taking 20% of the country's electricity, maybe the private households also 20%. Then these would be the shares, the weights which are applied here in the sectoral weighting to calculate the value of lost loads. Here, the value of lost load would be the highest, and here, using load shedding, it would be the lowest, because some countries have load shedding plans, so that if there is a scarcity coming in, then some consumers need to reduce their electricity consumption first, maybe the heavy industry first, before cutting down the hospitals. Yeah. The last way is the marginal reduction. If you're interested in that, we can talk about that in more detail later. Okay, then also minimum capacity need. This is a very detailed topic. If you're interested in that, we can also talk about that later in the discussion. But if this is taken into consideration, then in theory, the value of lost load would be increasing. So we see a variety of methodological decisions that a country can take here. And in the end, of course, if there's a large set of options to choose from on how to estimate the value of lost load, there are also different paths which are taken. So
Aaron,
yes,
I'm aware of time, so just noting that we only have about 10-15 minutes for the whole presentation to end. So take this into account, please.
Thanks, I'm aware. Thank you. Okay, so which approaches were used to calculate the single wall? The ACER benchmark, only using willingness to pay, only 3 countries used this benchmark. Others included also willingness to accept, and 4 countries used even other approaches to calculate the value of lost load. What about the weighting of sectoral value of lost load? So most countries used average load shedding plans, and almost the other half of the countries, they used average consumption shares. So this average marginal reduction that we talked about, no country used this calculation method. But already here we see that the countries, they took different paths. I think also for reasons which are really good to calculate the value of loss load. So here you see again the numbers that we showed in the beginning, that Professor Johannes Reichel showed in the beginning, with the country with the highest reported value of loss load, as well as the country with the lowest reported value of loss load. And one hypothesis that we had was that structural differences between the countries explain some of these differences in the value of loss load. So we tried inflation adjustment because some of these numbers were calculated in different times. So if we use inflation adjustment to rectify this, and then also we have purchasing power or different price levels between the countries, and also different energy intensities. So some countries may have a stronger share on heavy industry, and some countries may have a stronger share on the service sector. If we account for these differences, then yes, we can reduce the differences significantly from a factor of 7 to a factor of 4. Yeah. So we can explain actually 40% of the differences in the value of loss load due to structural differences. However, 60% of these differences we cannot explain, so this is why we made a more thorough study. So the second approach that we used was to calculate macro data based approach to see whether or not we have any differences here. And yes, we see that actually the differences become much more smaller if we use only a macro data based approach compared to the reported value of loss load number. So there's a hint here that there might be differences in the implementation decisions that each member state made. So in conclusion, there's a very large heterogeneity in the reported value of loss loads among the member states, and these cannot be attributed solely to structural differences between the countries. Yes, a significant share of these differences can be explained by structural differences, but not all of it. So we used standardized macroeconomic approaches to see, yes, there's a large discrepancy between reported value of loss load and also the macroeconomic value of loss load, or value of loss load calculated from the macroeconomic numbers. So our conclusion is that the different choices in methodological approaches is also a root of the heterogeneity that we see. In addition, the methodology for calculating this value of loss load is very, very complex. So this may lead to inadequate or uncoordinated implementation of specific parts of the ACER methodology because it's just too complex. So in fact, it is so complex that no member state has implemented the methodology in every aspect. Yeah. So basically, we have 2 points: the degree of freedom within the methodology, which may be too high, and a lack of coordination and implementation. Yeah, so these are basically 2 reasons for the heterogeneity that we see that we cannot explain. So how do we move forward? What are our recommendations. So our recommendations would be further supporting the member states with their value of loss load calculation, maybe an FAQ style support, because many questions pop up during the implementation only, and these are very good questions, and if there's a detailed FAQ, that might be helpful. Then best practice example might be helpful to show how we could proceed, what is helpful, what is not helpful. Maybe also training workshop and extended clarifications. And of course, not all the questions can be solved using FAQ, training, etc. Some are bound to pop up only during implementation, and here ad hoc bilateral interactions might be helpful and might be needed. So in principle, we have three options on how to proceed. First one is to streamline the methodology instead of having a broad range of options given in the regulation. Maybe set clearer rules instead of having this strong heterogeneity in how you proceed in the methodology. The second option could be to go for a coordinated data collection. So that, the member states, they are still responsible for conducting the surveys, but the implementation could be more coordinated. Maybe that might be helpful. And the third option would be to use a macro data-based approach. So this would require the revision of the current methodology instead of going for surveys, to go for a macro data-based approach. Of course, all these options come with downsides. Here we can see some. While the macro data-based approach, I'm only going to focus on this one, might streamline it the most. However, of course, the scope for the consideration of country specifics might be relatively low if we use a macro data-based approach. Also, not all cost components would be included if we were to use only a macro data-based approach. I talked about risk aversion and also direct cost of power interruptions, which are not included and reflected here if we use the macro data-based approach. And of course, this would mean also significant changes in the current regulation and the current methodology. This would be the strongest switch. So, of course, with every upside also comes a downside. Okay, I'm not sure if the results are already in for the value of loss load questions. Maybe Johannes, can you jump in?
I think we do have them. So here they are in our chat.
I don't see them actually. Johannes, maybe can you jump in?
Yes, of course. So to all the audience in the chat function, you now see a graph of the results of what you have reported your willingness to pay to avoid the specified outage would be. And the other group answered how much compensation they would expect if such an outage occurs. And what we see here is that the average expected, the average willingness to pay to avoid such an outage is in the €50 area, while for the WTA, for the willingness to accept such an outage, we have about 50% more. And this clearly shows what is one of the substantial problems with these two approaches. They will not deliver exactly the same number, which theoretically we should find. But these two numbers, but the willingness to accept is significantly higher. And that, of course, is a bit an issue here, because if you're using only one method or use one of the methods more pronounced, then you have an effect on the average that you are going to report. So I think it's very important to stick to the willingness to pay as the methodology has specified, and only conduct willingness to accept in the direct worth approach at best as a third and second measure, but not to rely on any of these two only. So thanks a lot for your support and in answering these questions. Very, very happy about that.
Thank you, Johannes. Then I'm going to hand over to you, back to you for, I think, the second Slido question.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks, Aaron. I think very, very, very helpful, the detailed explanation that you gave about the value of lost load. And I'm sure this will help member states in the future to first understand heterogeneity of the results better, and secondly, to work on more comparable results. Now we have a second Slido question for you. Please again help us and complete the question that we have there for you. We're really interested in how you see the challenges associated with the quantification of the metric. I will directly continue with the next chapter, but please don't consider this as holding you back from completing the Slido. I will continue to talk about the cost of new entry and the reliability standard. And as I said at the very beginning, these two metrics were troubling the entities, the responsible entities, less. So here the methodology was perceived much clearer and much easier to follow, but still we do see some deviations from the methodology. First of all, simply explained, what is cone and RS? First of all, the cone is the costs that a new capacity would mean, a new capacity that can be used for these kind of balancing purposes that we see in light of shortages. There are, again, a number of techno-economic parameters that need to be considered when calculating the cost of new entry. Of course, there are parameters in it that are tied to the specific technology that's investigated. Is it a gas turbine? Is it a wind power element? So technical specifications are required. Investment costs are required, but also capital costs are required. And very relevantly, one parameter we're talking in a minute, that is also the derating factor. Now, and the reliability standard is now meant to present the sweet spot of the costs versus the benefits, where the benefits are given by the avoided lost load. And then we have this formula in the right corner of the slide here that tells us the fixed costs of such an capacity installment divided by the value of lost load minus the costs that incurred during avoiding the outage are the loss of load expectation that we have here to consider as the reliability standard. And just as a quick view, we are not going into the details now, which technologies were frequently used by countries as standard or as reference technologies that might be, that could be relevant here as ramping up capacity, and which of the parameters were in the best possible way computed. So we see that, well, gas turbines and varying variants have been defined in many countries as relevant possible capacity enhancements to avoid this kind of capacity shortage. But we also see a varying number of other technologies that were investigated and that member states have considered as part of these analyses. Column-wise, we have colored how the varying parameters were calculated and used in the computation. We see in particular variable costs were a bit below average in their provision. We also see that the low-level threshold has actually been a bit of an issue. But in general, we feel that the computation of the cone values were carried out relatively well. Maybe two deviations that we do see. First of all, there had to be given a potential how much generation capacity could be provided by a certain technology as a maximum. So how much megawatt from additional gas turbines could be implemented under reasonable investment conditions. This potential has not been defined by all the countries. Even so, the potentials may be very, very big if you don't see a limit actually. That was not in part, that is not in line with the methodology. You do have to develop a potential. And secondly, the variable cone costs, that are the costs arising during the prevention of an outage, let's say it that way. These variable costs have not been provided by all the countries, but this was in line the methodology if justified well, in particular when these variable costs are so low that they can be neglected compared to the investment costs. So that led us then to the conclusions, and we will talk about them also hopefully in our Q&A session more. So in general, we think the cone and RS have been done without too many problems. Potentials should have been developed. If they haven't, that was a deviation. And we saw one difficulty that was relevant, namely when member states had to define their minimum capacity need according to the methodology, but that the executing entities have not always completely understood the relationship between the national resource adequacy assessments and these minimum capacity needs. So the principal idea would have been to derive the minimum capacity need from national resource adequacy assessments if available. So we have to clarify more that this is a very close interrelationship. So what's the conclusion? Basically, we are fine, but we could provide more information here, and that is equally relevant for the cone and the RS. And that is where we're arriving now at the Q&A session. And I would ask, first of all, to have a quick look at what you have provided us in the second Slido. In the chat, you find this kind of a word cloud. And what we see there very prominently in the center, I think that's about the choices. So there have been a number of decisions that the evaluator could take during the computation of the respective values. And these choices, I feel, have not been always very clear what the ramifications are. But I think with the help of what Aaron has presented about the impact of each of the choices, this should be actually be capable or doable by a better informed level next time. And transparency of the procedures sometimes has also been one of the central points that we see here from the valuable comments. So transparency of the whole procedure and the outcomes might deserve a little additional attention in the next round. But now I would ask our moderator, Vasilis, please guide us through the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Johannes and Aaron. It was a really dense but interesting, I think, presentation with many details. And I'm very surprised by the replies that we got in the last question, because actually these are exactly I would say it matches very well with what we had in our mind when we started this project. So to increase the transparency of how member states, how the bodies that calculated these metrics did that, and also what choices they had to make, because it's true that the methodology allows some flexibility in these choices. So I'm very happy to see that. Now we have quite some questions, and I will start as they are ranked in the Slido. And they are relevant for you, I think, Johannes and Aaron. So the first one is whether the expected total number of interruptions would alter the replies of the consumers with regards to willingness to pay. So how many interruptions in a year are expected, whether there's a high number or low.
So you mean if the willingness to pay would go up if people have more own experiences with?
What I understand from the question is that one other parameter that might change the reply to the question is, okay, we have a system that actually encounters several interruptions. Would that change my utility perception?
Yes. Okay, thank you. Well, literature offers different answers on these questions, but one of the results that we derive from literature is that when people, I mean, in Central Europe or in Europe, we mostly have a very low experience with power outages, in particular with more pronounced ones. And that, of course, makes it hard for people to assess the real damage in case such a thing is happening. But what we have seen in countries that have more outages or more regular, that people to some extent adapt to these outages. People learn a bit what do they need in preparatory of the next outage, and then reduces their damage that they get from an outage. So that is one possible reaction to experiences with outages, that your own vulnerability is decreasing, and by that we should also see willingness to pay values that could that are a bit lower.
If I may compliment here, I totally agree. Level of preparedness is higher for consumers who have more experience with power interruptions. So maybe an example in the US, I think they are much further in terms of bidirectional charging for electric vehicles, because one business case for car manufacturers they see is that the homeowners can continue to consume electricity even though there is a large-scale power interruption if they have an electric vehicle, because they can take the electricity from the car then. So that business case is much further developed in the US compared to here in Europe. And a reason might be because the consumers in the US experience more power interruptions than we do here in Europe.
Thank you. Thank you. And indeed, this actually links to another question that is further down, but I will take it now because it is actually somehow interrelated. Whether smart meters now, or to put it differently, with the introduction of smart meters and demand response possibilities, it would be would that lead to different results? My understanding is that the service should implicitly reflect the ability of the individual consumer to adjust hers or his consumption. But please, can you verify this, or if not?
So the introduction of smart metering basically increases the transparency of the own electricity consumption. And as such, it might aid people in understanding how depending they are on their own, on what quantities of electricity. So that might have a bit of an impact. But what we see, I believe, more is the other way around of the effect. So many of some distribution system operators are very actively exploiting the information from smart meters to identify specific locations of, in particular, smaller interruptions. And so they are reducing the response time to an outage and can reestablish electricity connection in a shorter time. So smart meters in general, I think, have a positive effect here. On the level of the individual consumers, maybe if their willingness to pay accuracy was hampered by low knowledge of the electricity consumption, but in general, they should report us their willingness to pay on a time span, and that's why this, in theory, could not have such a big impact actually.
My opinion on this topic would be this would be very helpful actually, having smart meters. I think in Germany we are discussing about targeted reductions regarding power consumption during times of shortages. Maybe sector coupling might be something, so that the charging of electric vehicles, the power amount would be reduced, or for heating systems in critical situations, so that not a consumer, a whole household would be shut off, so to say, but only single targeted consumers, where the consumers might not even notice that there's something going on. So that might be a game changer, in my opinion, for the topic. Yes.
Thank you. The next question is actually interesting. I don't know if we can provide a definite reply here, but it's interesting, so I will go through it. So there is this understanding that some vol values are higher than the maximum prices in the wholesale energy markets. And I think that this is something that needs to be taken into account by regulators. Actually, the regulation mentions that maximum wholesale prices need to reflect the maximum value of lost load. Obviously, the calculations that we saw, the numbers that we saw before, are not the maximum replies to the question, but rather the average. I think this is something that we need to reflect upon, the regulatory community. I don't know if you want to comment on that. Otherwise, I can move on to the next question. Johannes?
I mean, I just want to give a brief comment here. So in general, what Volt tries to do is to be a proxy for the actual damage dealt during an outage or to a shortage of electricity. And if we consider that we have this quantity, we have the exact value of electricity, basically, then I agree that the maximum bidding should not be lower than the maximum value of the electricity. On the other side, we are measuring here this value by a vol, and we have seen during the presentation of Aaron how heterogeneous and how much attached to uncertainties this quantity is and can be. And by setting these limits, there are also other considerations factoring in. And so I think we should not rely here only because we have seen in a study or in one or two studies vol values that go above this value, a complete change of these bidding structures. So in principle, yes, the damage should not be higher than the maximum bidding level, but in practice, we don't have the information to bring them perfectly in line.
I agree with Johannes. So in the textbook, I think it makes perfectly sense to have the consumer value not higher than the prices can be, because in this situation, if that were to be in the real case, then what would happen is that the level of supply would not be adequate for the consumers. So if that is the case, then the bidding maximums should be higher.
Thanks for that. I think there is a lot of thinking that needs to be done, but definitely something that we should be taking into consideration, not necessarily by adjusting the levels at that level, but definitely something that regulators need to look into it. Now, the next question is about explaining the macro data-based approach. I think this is this becomes a bit too much for this session. Maybe if we have time at the end, so I will skip this one, although it has is highly ranked. And I will go to the next one. So after the crisis, do we expect that people are more aware and that the difference, there will be different replies to the same questions? I think we have discussed this internally, but it's good to
I mean, I do.
Again.
Yes, I do remember there's a study from Sweden. I think it is, it's 10, 15 years old at least, but there by coincidence, there has been a willingness to pay study ongoing. And during about the midst of this data collection, there has been a pronounced power outage in Sweden. And what they see is that the values people have reported before that our power outage has happened were higher than the values people have reported after that power outage has happened. Because many of the people in our super supply secure world may have even more negative or more fearful opinions about the power outage, that in some cases these have then evolved. That's only an example, of course, of one incident, and we cannot generalize that to a general finding. But at least for outages that end without a disaster. So at least for those, people might be prepared better for the next outage and may have made the experience, well, we are actually set to at least stand through a few hours of an outage, but not to use this result to transport to these kind of blackout outages that are huge in geography and long in time.
Well, I think there should be significant differences before the crisis and after the crisis. One reason for that would be inflation, I would think. So because inflation has been really high since then, or before, comparing the figures before the crisis and after the crisis. So I think that might have a positive impact, not in a good sense, on the value of lost load. The second reason I see is risk aversion. I have talked about this, that risk aversion significantly drives value of lost load. So if people are more afraid of an energy crisis, a looming energy crisis, then their willingness to pay to avoid such a crisis will go higher. We have seen this in Germany when people suddenly started to buy electric heaters for their homes because they were afraid that there wouldn't be enough natural gas to heat the homes. I'm sure that not a lot of people needed to use these electric heaters, but or just the fact that people bought these electric heaters showed that there suddenly was an increase in willingness to pay to avoid potential issues here. And so if people are more afraid, then willingness to pay increases. And with that, value of lost load.
Thanks. It's interesting, the case of Sweden that you mentioned, Johannes. So one question tries to link electricity price in one country with the value of lost load. So what do you think? Do electricity prices in general affect the willingness to pay?
I mean, in principle, it's important to understand that the price of electricity that you consume is a different metric, a different quantity than the damage of 1 kilowatt hour not served. So these are in principle two very different quantities, and by that we would think, or we would expect, that the impact of prices on willingness to pay is not existing, or is not a relevant one. But in practice, of course, people will always adapt their opinions, their evaluation of goods to products that are closely related to the one that they are evaluating. And when people make their choice about a willingness to pay to avoid a power shortage, they may consider the price of getting that electricity as well. So again, here we are, at least when we're talking about the household level, where these kind of subjective opinions are entering a bit more than on the enterprise level. There we might have this effect that in times of higher electricity prices, also the willingness to pay may be higher. On the other hand, we may completely see adverse effects, namely that people say electricity is so expensive anyway, I'm definitely not going to pay something on top of that because I deserve this expensive electricity, and people, responsible people, have to make sure I receive it. So that is a bit of a topic with methodology on the household side, I believe. In general, theoretically, these two should be decoupled to a large extent?
Well, electricity prices in perfect competition are a result from supply and demand, and value of lost load is focusing only on the demand side of the market. So yes, of course, there's an interlinkage between the two, between an electricity price and the value of lost load. But as Johannes said, usually the value of lost load is much higher than the electricity price that we see because of the many economic upsides that come with electricity consumption.
Thanks. Then there is an interesting question. So how do the differences in reliability standards between member states, between interlinked systems, influence, for example, the industrial sector? It's highlighted here, but I would just generalize. What is this the impact of having a very high reliability standard in one country and a very low reliability standard in another country? I mean, I can think about several impacts and also some distortive effects in terms of the market, but what is your view on that?
So first of all, we have one reliability standard per country, and this reliability standard will be a specific average between a number of sectors. So we will always have the situation that for an individual sector, their, let's say, true reliability standard or their individual optimum will be different than the overall country's reliability standard. So we have, even within a country, we may have sectors that are disadvantaged by the relative reliability standard the country set, and one that may experience a bit of an advantage by this standard. And of course, these effect might exacerbate over varying countries. But the basic idea would be that the reliability standard in a country, if it's correctly the economic optimum, then I don't see we have a disadvantage necessarily. Of course, we're coming to a situation where reliability standard points in a way that there are a lot of overinvestments in reliability security that are not economically efficient. Then energy there would become more expensive compared to their competing neighboring countries, and that would then a disadvantage for those who are dependent strongly on energy prices. So one other reason why we are calling for a best possible comparability of approaches and results to make sure that there is not that all are playing on the same field. But again, that is actually, despite the very high numbers between the wall values, I think the reliability standard values, which of course were not calculated by all the countries, but were a bit more homogeneous than one could expect from the wall values.
Yeah, actually, I think it also depends on the national regulation, because what does it mean if a country has a lower reliability standard than another country? Then the translation of that on specific industries or companies, that will only become relevant if there are load shedding plans in place, who's getting turned off and who's not getting turned off. What is the compensation mechanism? Is there a compensation mechanism behind that, yes or no? So I think that national regulation here makes all the difference in the end, probably, and not the reliability standard per se.
Thank you. Very good point, Aaron, this one. It seems that the question on macro data becomes very like highly liked. So I am keen in giving it away. So Could you very briefly explain, either you, Johannes, or Aaron, this macro data analysis approach in a very
I'll
few
leave the floor
words?
here to Aaron. I think you're the expert in that regard.
Okay. Well, in the macro data-based approach, assumptions are made on how companies, how industries, they actually produce their goods, and using these assumptions, usually production functions are derived and used to find out a relationship between the value added that an industry, that a sector creates, and their electricity consumption. And using this assumption, usually it's taking a Leontief production function, for instance, then yeah, we can derive for this industry a value of loss load, saying that if there's no electricity, then this car manufacturer cannot produce any more cars. So we know that the value added for this industry would be X. We know that the electricity consumption for, in this case, would be Y. We divide X by Y and we receive a value of loss load. For private households, similarly, a production function is assumed. Here we usually translate free time or leisure time into value, in monetary value. So it will be in euros, and divide that also with the electricity consumption. And then we also, for the households, get a number for the value of lost load. And then we have talked about the weighting of the different sectors. There are different approaches, but if we do this weighting, then in a way we can receive a value of lost load, which we derived from macroeconomic data instead of using survey data. And that is basically the easier part, or might be an easier part, to derive the value of loss load instead of using large surveys. But of course, it also comes with downsides. Some cost components are not included if we use these macro data-based approaches, like risk aversion, which I've mentioned, as well as some cost components, direct cost components, the food in your fridge or in your freezer that is getting spoiled. Of course, it's not reflected in the value of free time or leisure where we have data about. But in the official statistics, there are probably not enough data points on what you have in your freezer or in your fridge.
Thank you, Aaron, for this one. I hope it is it's clear. And here one clarification from my side. I think it's important to say this, that as you showed, there are different methods. While the discussions on what method would be preferable during the methodology development, the regulators, ACER, the TSOs, they always need to take into account what the regulation says. And the definition of value of loss load in the regulation specifically mentions that this is the willingness to pay. So although we acknowledge that there are different methods and that the combination of these methods actually would most probably give you the right value, regulators and TSOs needed to stick to the regulatory provisions here. And I think that the methodology reflects this need of combining the willingness to pay with other methods as well. So in this respect, I think that this flexibility is something that is useful. How is it used is another discussion. See, Johannes, you want to comment on that or not? We can go to the next question.
Yeah, I think you've explained it very well. So yes, willingness to pay is the one to be in line with the methodology, and that's the one that has to be computed. And others, as I said in the introduction, are interesting and additions and may help to get a precise value, but the willingness to pay is the backbone of the methodology, and that's what should be calculated.
I may have a slightly different opinion, actually. I think it gives way to country specifics if we use maybe a combination of different methodologies, because in some countries the regulation might be in a way, when I mentioned compensation payments earlier, maybe the willingness to accept approach may be more appropriate or more reflective of the realities in that specific country. But of course, with these very comprehensive choice set, on the one hand, we give countries the option to account for all these specifics, but of course that may render comparability really difficult. So I think the difficulty is to find this thin line between too much complexity and too little complexity for the methodology, and that is super challenging. And I'm really glad, or I hope that this study also provided some insights on what might be too much and what might be too little.
Thanks for these thoughts. I will take some time from the concluding remarks for another final question, which I find kind of interesting. And then it's how does the political cost of having higher number of outages or likelihood of outages is factored in this exercise, and it's not only an economic calculation. If you have a comment on that, I will certainly not go into this, but if you would like to comment, please, one minute each.
I mean, the political costs basically are very relevant ones. I mean, if I was a person in charge of having to make decisions affecting power supply reliability, this would certainly be something. I'm just thinking that in many countries we have supply security, at least in the public, as a non-topic. At least before 22. I really have the feeling that this was something that was so natural for people, like water coming out of the tap. So I think the political dimension or the political criticality for the public debate has not been there in the past so far, and this may also translate in the attention to the willingness to pay or to the wall in general. So. I would be really wondering how your questions would be answered for a country where you see outages regularly. We mentioned the USA have a different level, at least some parts there, and of course other countries have that even more. But I believe for many of the European countries, we don't see yet these topics so much in a political agenda that a policymaker can derive either advantage or a disadvantage from a strong position there.
Yeah, I think this question is very valid, as there is, of course, a strong political dimension involved. And yeah, I think we have seen also in the recent past in Europe and elsewhere that actually you may do good political campaigns with positive results for politicians or parties if you use scaremongering as a method. But I don't think this is my level of expertise to comment on that. So yes, I agree. This is probably a factor which we should be aware of.
Thank you both. I think we may go to the closing session, and I will be very brief. I think it was very, very interesting. Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you for your work all these months and your dedication to the project. I think the findings are very useful. The recommendations as well. I don't know how they will land in the debate among regulators and the wider stakeholders and policymakers, but I think that they are very relevant indeed. With that, I think we can close the webinar. I would like to thank all the attendees for your participation also in the Slido questions. And yeah, have a nice day. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.